So, a lot I want to cover today. I want to get through a bunch of material again for the exam on Thursday. Remember we have an exam? You know, yes, oh yeah. I always say I really do hate exams, but I understand I don't hate them, giving them quite as much as you probably hate taking them. So I get it, you know. But it's not particularly pleasurable for me either. I'd rather just sit up here and talk about stuff. But a question already. Go ahead.
What's the format of the midterm? Is like multiple choice or like essay?
It's all. Yeah, I'm going to talk about it. It's all in the syllabus too. But I'm going to go over the exam here for a second, because I'm sure a lot of people have exactly those same questions. Okay, so what I want to do today is really talk about sort of the last little part of social psychology. Again, a really fast tour through what's sometimes referred to as social cognition, how we think about other people, how we perceive other people and people in other groups. So we're going to talk about phenomenological assumption, dual process thinking, this idea that there's kind of two, that we sometimes think deeply, sometimes we think very shallowly, and the different sorts of effects occur in those conditions. And I really want to get down and talk to the end a little bit about racial bias and sort of try to tie that in with some of the stuff that's been going on recently, the police shootings and et cetera, and things like that. So I want to get through a bunch of stuff and hopefully leave time. So let me talk, again, you should have seen this lots of times, right? So this is about the exam. This Thursday, get here early. There is an overflow room for some of you. If you're in that room, you have been contacted by Daniel. So just so we make sure everybody's got enough seats, there's another room. Again, not to worry about it unless you've been contacted. And I think it was the people that kind of got let in at the end that made the agreement they would take it in an overflow room. Covers the lecture material and the readings. I'm going to talk about all this in a second, right? The 2 chapters and all the stuff in a Norton Reader. Bring with you Scantron, pencils, student ID. Right? Get here early so we can get organized. You should have plenty of time to take the exam, but you know, the faster we can get going, get it handed out, the more time everybody's got. And the study guide, it should either be posted now or soon. It's done, it's out there. I know that's what I want to talk a little bit about that thing just for a second, right? So I don't know, Daniel is not here. He's probably doing it actually now. I sent it to him a little while ago. So by the end of class, I'm pretty positive that will be posted up there. The study guide is not, and I've said this before, it's not the silver bullet you might imagine it to be, right? It's just really an outline of the lectures, but it gives you the concepts that you need to know from all the lectures, right? Sort of laid out all in one place. And then what it does is it talks about the readings, and it tells you what you need to know out of the readings. Now you'll notice, and people have asked already, that there is lots of material that I don't talk about in lecture, right? There's not a huge amount of reading in the class. You know, we're only covering like 6 chapters of text material, plus these Norton Readers. And I don't talk about a lot of those, but I try to give you some sense of what you need to know out of that material, right? So I tell you, here's a list, you know, from Gleitman chapter 12, which I didn't talk a huge amount, a lot of that material, and it says what you need to know out of that chapter. If it's not on that study guide, it's not on the exam. Right? If it's not on that study guide, it's not on the exam. Okay? So that helps to kind of settle that down. And then with the Norton Readers, again, what I try to give you a hint about all those, what I want to know. I'm not looking in those Norton Readers to find some obscure thing on page 23 that you probably didn't notice, right? I'm trying to ask you, what did that guy or woman have to say, right, about that? Right? What's the kind of gist? What's the point of that? So I want you to get out the basic point, right? But there will be questions on those, on things that haven't been in lecture, right? Things that are just in a read. There will be, so that you're rewarded for doing that. So study those. Use the study guide to help you. A couple other things people have asked me over time. Do I need to know names, right, or dates? No. Right, I'm not going to ask you, hey, what did Jones do in 1932, or what year did Jones do this thing, right? I give names and dates and everything so that you could look things up so that people get credit for the research that they do. I show pictures sometimes, right? People deserve to be recognized for the work that they do, but I'm not going to use those as cues. You're focus on the ideas, right? On the concepts in there. So you're not going to get, and those are on this, many of the dates and everything are on the study guide too, right? But I'm not going to use those as a cue, right, or as a way to try and get into the information. Right, so there'll be stuff on lecture, there'll be stuff on both, there'll be stuff just on the readings, and, right, trying to pitch down the middle and get you guys to make sure you know the core concepts in class. Any questions about the exam? So other questions that you have, right, you've got discussion sections tomorrow, maybe even today, I don't remember. Go to those. For those are reviews, those are going to be review sessions. They'll be helping you with the material on the exam. I have my special office hours. I forgot to put them up there at 3 o'clock on Wednesday if you want to come, and if you have a lingering question, you want to talk to me in my office. Okay. Otherwise, we're geared up, ready to go for the exam. Any questions? Excellent. So, it's always hard to the first part of the course in a sense because this is my field, and so I want to tell you all about it, right? But again, today I'm going to cover something that I could cover in an entire class, and I'm going to cover it in one day and try to give you a feeling for what this area of research is about. And it's a general field that's often referred to as social cognition, again, a part of social psychology. And it's the part that's really focused on social thinking. So a lot of what we've been talking about is how behavior of other people shapes what you do, and it also shapes what you think. But there's sort of another way to think about it. Part of social psychology is, how do I make judgments about you? Why do I think you're a nice person, a smart person? How do I make those kind of judgments? Right? How do I perceive other people? And one of the ways that goes well, accurately sometimes, and sometimes not so well, not so accurately, that people show certain kinds of biases, which is the kind of thing I've been interested in over the years. So social cognition again just means thinking. You can define this as how we perceive and think about ourselves and each other. So some of it's about, you're a person too, right? So social cognition has been interested in how people think about themselves, how they make judgments about them, how good you are at things. How do you figure out things about yourself as well as other people? How we process and make meaning out of our social encounters. Again, major research field in social psychology. A lot of times people say, well, what does this have to do with this other notion, this sort of central idea of situationism, right, that we've talked about, right? That part of social psychology is that you're affected by the behaviors that or the situations that you inhabit, right? Those determine your behavior as well as your sort of individual personal characteristics, right? So let me sort of connect these up with you. And let me do that by talking about an idea that there's a long history in social psychology, or in psychology in general, right? The idea of stimulus and response. That this used to be sort of the dominant way of thinking about behaviors, that there's some stimulus. Could be somebody else's behavior, could be the context. If you're thinking about animals, right, you put them in to some situation where you expose them to some experience, right? So there's some stimulus, and then there's a response, right? That you respond with some kind of behavior to a certain kind of stimulus. If I turn up the heat, do you get more aggressive? If you're stimulated by some kind of reward or whatever it is, there's a stimulus and there's a response, right? So, and again, this is very consistent with the idea of situations, right? That people's behavior very often is a function of some situation, some stimulus, right? You won't go into a situation and you behave in that way. Now, social psychology sort of accepts this idea of stimulus response, right? But there's part of it that when you're thinking about people, right, it all gets a little bit more complicated, right? It's not just that you're responding to what the actual stimulus is, it's that people respond to what they think the stimulus is, to how they perceive the stimulus, right? So there's sort of there's a person involved in this, right? There's some person who looks at that stimulus and imparts meaning to it. right? It's often, I refer to this as the phenomenological assumption. Phenomenology is just the study of experience. It means that people don't really respond to objective stimuli, they respond to subjective stimuli, right? How they perceive it. If I think that you're a jerk, somehow I've decided that you're a nasty person, I'm going to act towards you as if you're a nasty person, and it really doesn't matter whether you are or not, right? If I somehow think that you're a bad person, either I've heard about you, maybe it's because of your race or something, your gender, I don't know, it doesn't really matter, and I think that you're that kind of person, you come into my office and say, what the hell do you want? Right? And it doesn't matter what you're really like in some sense, right? And that's what's interesting. And if I'm wrong, if I think you're a jerk and you're not, I think you're aggressive and you're not, I think you're nice and you're not, then I'm making a mistake. And so it's interesting to study how it is that I decide those things, because sometimes they're wrong, right? This is another way to describe this idea from a very old famous book in 1923 by Thomas and Thomas, that if men define situations as real, they're real in their consequences. Now, I assume he means women as well, but it was 1920-something, right? So he didn't talk like that. But the idea is that if I think something's real, it's real in its consequences. In a sense, it's real in terms of how it affects my behavior. If I am somehow delusional and decide that that white light there is a train coming toward me, right? I'm going to jump out of the way. It doesn't matter that there's not a train. I'm going to jump out of the way because I believe that there's a train there. Right? And so studying how people form perceptions, how they form these subjective perceptions of situations, helps to understand their behavior. Right? And the idea that underlies a lot of social cognition research is that very often the sort of judgments that I make about other people are wrong. And that those, because we're wrong about other people, that's very often the source of lots of social conflict. Things like prejudice, stereotyping, other kinds of things. Because people misperceive other people in some ways, they show certain biases in the way they perceive things, and that affects their behavior. And so the study of those, by studying those things and how people, again, sort of perceive subjective situations, not objective ones, right? That the study of that can help to uncover lots of social problems. If we just understood the way people think about things and the ways that they think about things that sometimes aren't quite right. So that's kind of the way it ties into the rest of social psychology and the situational influence. It's about subjective situations, right? And there's been a huge amount of study on how people think, and there's kind of two ways that it's often characterized. And you've sort of seen this before, really, in some other stuff we've talked about. So here's the way to describe it. And get out your clickers. I'll do this as a clicker task. Do you think people think like scientists? Largely, if you had to choose between one characterization of people, would it be that people think like scientists, they're rational, thoughtful, methodical, like Albert Einstein, or are people less rational? Are they a little more like Homer Simpson, maybe? They're emotional, thoughtless, impulsive. So which do you think really better describes people? A, people think like scientists, or B, people are less rational and think kind of emotionally, thoughtlessly, impulsively? Which of those? A or B? A, Einstein, B, Homer. Okay. So we got Homer wins overwhelmingly, right? You guys are hopefully, right? I mean, you picked some of this up from the class. Is that people think in ways very often, and the real answer, honestly, in this is that both are true, right? But people very often think less rationally than we kind of imagine, and you have a sense for that. Really, again, what the gist of social psychological research has shown over sort of accumulated wisdom over the years is it's generated this notion of what's called dual process thinking. That there's really two ways that people are capable of thinking, and two systems that underlie those. right? So first of all, they're cleverly, they've come to be called, because they're so sort of general and generic, right? System 1 and System 2 thinking. It's made popular in a book in particular by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. Danny Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in 2002 in psychology. Actually, in economics, there is no Nobel Prize in psychology. But the basic idea is that first we have a sort of underlying system, a system that makes decisions quickly. System 1 is intuitive, it's reactive, it's emotional, right? It tends to be affected by whether you like something or don't like something. Associative, like something brings up something else. It's quick, it's effortless, it happens, it gives you answers quickly. It tends to be slow learning because it's this really automatic system that's probably grounded in primitive kinds of thinking. It's kind of, sometimes people refer to it semi-facetiously as the lizard brain, right? It's the sort of cognitive systems that are built in us for a long time, right? That we tend to make decisions very quickly, produce things quickly. And then there's another system. We're responsive sometimes to this kind of quick thinking, that ideas just come to mind, or I don't like that person, or boy, I shouldn't do that. Whatever it is, these quick kind of judgments we make. Other times, however, we're capable of, because of our cortical development and this sort of the sophisticated cognitive skills that humans have, right, are captured by this idea of System 2 thinking. And System 2 thinking is sort of the more effortful kind of thinking. It's more systematic, deliberative, cognitive, rational, right? It's at least capable of rationality. Tries to be rational. Oh, if that's true, well, maybe this should be true. And it doesn't always get it right, but it tries to think rationally. It tends to be slower. It requires more effort. It's more flexible. It learns better, right? So you can learn things. In this class, hopefully you're learning things. You're using System 2 to listen to me, try and process, think hard about what I'm saying. It's controlled in the sense you have to apply it. Sometimes your mind drifts to things besides me. I know you try not to think about anything except for me while you're here, but your mind, and you got to go, oh wait, I got to pay attention. There's a test on Thursday, right? It's controlled. It's something you can, so automatic. System 1 is just kind of, it just happens quickly. It responds to stimuli. System 2 is something you can control and apply, right? And it's the more modern, it's the more sophisticated system, right? And so the idea is that we have both of these things. We have this part of us that's making quick decisions, and that it responds to these kind of basic associations, and sometimes sort of has a real evolutionary sense to it, right? That things are happening quickly. And then we're also capable of System 2 thinking. This should remind you a little bit of something we talked about in persuasion, right? The elaboration likelihood model has the same sort of underlying notion. It's an example of what's called a dual process theory. It says that sometimes, we just respond to peripheral cues. If we don't care very much, we're not thinking very much, and we're just going, oh, experts are smart, or if I like this person, I'm going to buy it. Other times, when there's more on the line, we kick in, we're able to think carefully, slowly, right? Methodically. Doesn't mean we always get it right, but we're trying hard to do it, right? So the idea is that there's these two sort of systems of thinking that everybody has, and that most people think that this is the way we think all the time. Oh yeah, I'm a rational person, I'm thinking all the time, but very often we're subject to these kinds of biases, and these kinds of automatic processes are what kick in and lead us to conclusions that with a little bit of thought you can realize, oh, maybe that isn't quite rational. Maybe that isn't quite right? So I want to use this framework to talk about some research. What I want to do is talk about System 2 thinking, that we're some work on sort of how people make judgments about other people that sort of suggests, yeah, people are capable of the System 2 thinking. It sort of characterizes System 2 thinking. And then I'm going to talk about some examples of System 1 thinking, how those bias the kind of judgments that we make and lead to some sort of interesting and very often kind of troubling sorts of phenomena. So the sort of good example of, one of the sort of classic topics in all of social cognition is this idea of what's called causal attribution, right? How do we attribute causes to people's behavior? Why does somebody just laugh up here, right? Why is somebody, why are you doing that? We're looking at people, we want to know why things are happening, right? And the best way to describe it right, or the sort of overarching metaphor that was proposed by a guy named Fritz Heider, this wonderful old social psychologist, talked about people are like scientists. That if you really want to know what people are like, they're just like, what scientists want to do is figure out the causes of behavior. Why do planets revolve around stars? You know, why do satellites revolve around moons? They want to know why things happen, right? Scientists want to know why, what causes things to happen. And psychologists are no different, right? I said that this is why I want to know why things happen. I'm trying to prove why things happen. And Fritz Heider said, you know, people are really like scientists. In a sense, they're like really like psychologists. They want to know why people behave the way they do, right? So they act like scientists. They're interested in the causes of things. Well, why are they interested in the causes of things? Because knowing the cause of things is really damn useful, right? It's the same reason scientists want to know. Right? I want to know what causes things because then I can use it to my advantage. If I know what causes internal combustion, I can then make an engine, and I can drive places, and I can do things, right? I want to know why. Well, why do you want to know things about people? Because it's really helpful. So, for example, if you were going skiing, and you see somebody falling down like this guy that was been falling down the corner, you want to know, I wonder why he fell down. And what Heider suggests is there's sort of two reasons, right, that we perceive in that situation. Real causation is more complicated than this, right? But he said perceived causation, the way people think about it, they basically make this really fundamental distinction. It's either something about the skier or it's something about the situation. Something about the person or something about the situation. And he refers to it as, again, personal causality versus impersonal causality. So did that skier fall down that hill because of something about him? He's a crummy skier. That's why he fell. It's about him. He caused it in his lack of ability. Or is it about something like the situation? Is it about that hill? Is that a really difficult hill? Are the conditions really bad? Right? And figuring out whether he fell because it was something about him or something about the situation is really damn useful. Right? Because you want to know, is it okay for me to ski? And if this person falls down the hill and he decided something about him, well, sure, I can ski, it seems fine. If it's something about the situation, then, wow, okay, maybe I shouldn't go down this hill, maybe it's dangerous. So again, just like it's useful for scientists to know what causes things, it's useful for people to know what causes things. Or another example, maybe closer to home, you see your boss. You're thinking about, I really want to ask for a raise. I'm really thinking about a raise. I'm doing good. I'm going to go ask my boss. You see your boss yelling at somebody, and some other one of your colleagues in the room going, get out, and fires him. You want to know, okay, I wonder why he did that. Was it something about the boss? Right? Is the boss in a really bad mood? Does he hate people that go in and talk to him? So maybe I shouldn't ask for a raise? Or maybe it's something about the person. Maybe the person was a terrible person or was insulting the boss. So what causes things is really important, determining whether you should go skiing, whether you might want to ask your boss for a raise or whatnot. And people go through this. And according to Heider, they make this basic distinction between personal and impersonal causality. Right? And that's the fundamental decision we make, psychologically, that we make. Gee, when you do something, did it tell me something about you, or was it just a product of the situation that you were in? So how do we do that? Right? How do we figure that out? Heider was the first one to sort of talk about that we make that's kind of an important distinction, that people are like scientists trying to figure out causality. But then how it is that people do that was something that got worked out later, and largely the person who's seen as sort of the major figure in this is a guy named Hal Kelly, who was at UCLA for years and years and years. And what he really did is he tried to figure out from Heider, well, how would I decide whether something you do is caused by you or caused by the situation? And he really took that person as scientist metaphor even a step further. And really, it's like people are like statisticians. They're not just like lay scientists, they're lay statisticians. They use the same sort of statistical logic that we as scientists use to figure out what causes things. You use it intuitively to make judgments about other people. And it's essentially the logic of covariation. right? Covariation or correlation. That if something is there, if you see two things associated, the one thing's there when the other thing's there, well then they're related. But then if you pull the one thing away and the other thing disappears too, oh, right? One's there when the other one's there. That's not there when the other one's not there. Oh, they're somehow related. Maybe they're causally related, right? This idea that as things get stronger, the other one should get stronger, right? So this general idea of covariation, that if the behavior, if I'm trying to figure out, does your behavior, is it caused by you? If it's caused by you, it should covary with you. It should be there when you're there and not there when you're not there, right? But if it's about the situation, it should be there whenever the situation's there, but not there when the situation's not there. Now, I'll keep unpacking this, right? This simple kind of logic. So Kelly essentially says that we use three different kinds of information when we make judgments about other people, right? And it's the pattern that sort of occurs across those that indicates what causes things. So the first thing we do is we use what's called distinctiveness information. So is the person's behavior unique to this situation? Right? Does it occur in this situation but not in others? Does this person do this in this situation, not in another? Let me use the same example that Kelly actually used in his 1967 paper. So he talked about a guy named Ralph. And Ralph was watching a movie. And Ralph is laughing at that movie. And you want to know, why is Ralph laughing at that movie? What's causing Ralph to laugh at that movie? Is it a funny movie? Is it something about the situation, the movie that's making him laugh? Or is it something about Ralph? Right? That he's just kind of a laughy, easily amused kind of guy, right? So the first thing you do is how distinctive is it? Right? How distinctive is it to this situation? If you've seen Ralph's seen lots of movies, right? And Ralph laughs at every damn movie he sees. Doesn't matter what it is, doesn't matter whether it's The Walking Dead, it doesn't matter whether it's, Halloween '87 or whatever the movie is, whatever, lead character dies of cancer, he didn't care. Ralph laughs at all. So in that case, distinctiveness would be low. So Ralph laughs at this movie, but he laughs at every movie. Or compare that to when distinctiveness is high. When Ralph laughs at this movie and you've seen him at lots of other movies and he doesn't laugh. Right? That's how if it's high in distinctiveness, he does this in this situation and not in others. If it's low in distinctiveness, he does it in all situations. If it's high in distinctiveness, what does that suggest? If Ralph laughs only at this movie and not at other movies, what does that suggest about what's causing him to laugh? The movie or him? The movie, right? So think about it. If you just see him laugh at this movie, he doesn't laugh at any other movies, oh, yeah, it must be the movie that did it. If he laughs at every movie, it must be something about Ralph. Ralph's a little funny, he laughs at things a lot. Right? High in distinctiveness means it's something about Ralph, low means it's not. Second thing you look at, according to Kelly, is consensus information. So what are other people doing? Is everybody laughing at this movie? Consensus means, what's everybody doing? Is everybody laughing at this movie? Or is only Ralph laughing at this movie? What is it? Is it behavior that's unique to Ralph or to other people? So if everybody's laughing at the movie, what does it suggest is causing the laughter? The movie, right? If everybody laughs at a movie, it's funny. That's the way we define it virtually, right? If Ralph's the only person laughing at the movie, suggests it might be something about Ralph again, right? Everybody else is crying. Ralph's in the back, ha, ha, what a great movie. Whoa, that's funny, right? So both of those tell you something about whether it has to do with Ralph or the movie. The other kind of information that Kelly says we use really doesn't directly relate to whether it's about Ralph or about the movie, but kind of whether it's something stable about those things. And that's what he calls this consistency information. Is behavior consistent over time? Does Ralph always laugh at this movie every time he sees it, when he sees it on video, when he sees it on Blu-ray, when he reads the book, whatever it is? If he, every time does he laugh? Or is it, you've seen him see this movie before and he's never laughed at this movie, but now he's laughing? Right? If it's consistent, if it's high in consistency, it tells you that something about the movie, stable about the movie, or something stable about Ralph. It kind of tells you there's something stable going on. The same thing happens. Again, it's like a replication in science. The same thing's happening. But if it's only, you've seen Ralph see this movie lots of times, and he's never laughed before, and he's laughing now, well, you know, maybe Ralph, you know, lit up a big joint or, you know, something before the movie. I don't know what's going on. He's just laughing, right? Or if he's not laughing, and everybody always says, well, maybe the theater's really hot or, you know, something like that. It suggests something circumstantial, right? So the first two really have to do with whether it's internal, whether you use this logic to decide it's something about Ralph. Does it co-vary with Ralph or does it co-vary with the situation? Again, you can see if it's, the idea is the pattern of these things over time that really matters. If it's high in distinctiveness, right, and high in consistency, if Ralph is laughing at this movie, he doesn't laugh at any other movies, everybody's laughing at this movie, it suggests that it's something about the movie. And if the same thing happens all the time, it really suggests it's something that must be a funny movie. Everybody laughs. Ralph doesn't laugh at every movie. Wow, it's a funny movie, right? Laughter is there when the movie's there. It's not there when the movie's not there. Alternatively, again, if Ralph laughs at every movie, nobody else is laughing at this movie, and that same thing happens every time, well, the behavior co-varies with Ralph. When Ralph's there, there is laughter. But if you look at other people, there isn't any laughter, right? That's the logic of it. It's a complete sort of scientific logic. And I can imagine what you're saying right now to yourself. You say, I don't even understand how the hell, what's Ditto talking about? I don't know what's going on. How could I possibly be doing this every day of my life, right? But that's what Kelly's saying, right, is that we do this every day. We're so habituated to doing it, that logic is there. And you don't realize that the logic that you're using is really a scientific logic, right? We're really well practiced at it. We're so well practiced at it. Again, it's sort of, we do it even when it has to do with us, right? So look at, here's another example, just to kind of play the same thing out in the skiing example. Again, low distinctiveness, the person falls on every hill. Right? Low consensus, no one else is falling. High consistency, falls every time. This guy must be a bad skier, right? You see him falling on every hill, nobody else is falling. Happens every time, must be something about him. High in distinctiveness, he falls on this hill. High in consensus, everyone else is falling too. High in consistency, everybody's falling every time. It must be a difficult hill, right? So that's that same logic as before, but you have to realize that's the way you figure out whether you're a good skier or not too. Right? You use exactly the same logic. I keep trying to ski and I fall down every time. Right? And I don't know what's going on. I go on these hills, these little 4-year-olds are swishing down with no skis and I'm falling on my butt every time. Well, what do you decide after a while? You're a bad skier. Right? You use that same logic. Right? But at times when you fall down, but you know, you don't always fall down. You know, you've been on lots of hills and done really well. You've seen other people not be able to do as well as you will. Then it tells you something about you. We use that same logic to decide what we're like, what other people are like, right? And it is essentially a scientific form of logic that people really do, and they are capable of this. And there's lots of evidence that people make just these kinds of judgments, right? That they're capable of using this kind of attributional logic. Again, given the time, given the motivation to figure things out, we will use this kind of logic. But do we use it all the time? Okay, question, right in the middle. Real loud.
Both of them say high consistency, so what kind of assumption would you make if there was a low?
Yeah, so that's a really good point, right? So high consistency is sort of necessary. It has to replicate to know that it's either about the skier or about the hill. Right? If you have low consistency, it suggests it's something circumstantial, like the slope's icy that day. Well, I always have skied down this hill, and it's been fine before, but now everybody's falling and I'm falling. Well, it must be icy. It must be bad conditions. Or, you know, everybody's laughing, there must be some intoxicant. Or, you know, whatever it is, it's a circumstantial, but it's not something stable. So consistency is about sort of being able to say something real. And that's exactly the same logic, right, that we use in science. Right? It happens again and again. You can say there's something stable going on. If it only happens under certain conditions, well, then it's those conditions that do it. Right? So people are capable of this kind of logic. Do we do it all the time? No. Right? We screw this up all the time. Because we have this sort of system one, right? These shortcuts that we use a lot, right? That we feel in certain ways and we don't always process all the information all the way through. We do when we have a lot of time and energy, we're capable of it, but we don't always naturally do it. And in fact, the people that studied attribution, right, almost immediately discovered that there was a deviation from this kind of perfect scientific logic. And it's been seen to be so basic that it's now come to be called the fundamental attribution error. And the fundamental attribution error, very simple. Basically, right, it's this idea that people tend to underestimate the role of situational factors in attribution. The way that Fritz Heider talked about it, he said that behavior, he used perceptual language. He said behavior engulfs the field. So when I see you do something nasty, right, mean, I go, whoa, that was mean. And you're the one, you're my focal point, right? And it may be that somebody provoked you to do that, but I don't see them nearly as well. They're kind of out on the periphery, so I tend to go, you may have been completely provoked to do that mean thing, but when I see you do it, I go, wow, she's mean, right? I don't fully account for all the situational factors because behaviors are right there in front of you, right? It captures your attention. You may notice that there's some situational inducement, but we don't tend to use that information very well. So again, so people assume that hostile behavior, for example, indicates a hostile disposition, even when plausible situational explanations for the behavior exist, right? And it's such a fundamental tendency. We do this all the time. People do things and we go, wow, that tells us a lot about them, and we forget to recognize that situations cause behavior. In some sense, social psychology as a discipline is a institutional repudiation of the fundamental attribution error. So the idea is that everybody keeps assuming that your behavior tells you a lot about you, and what social psychologists said, hey guys, sometimes the situation's at fault, right? And people have this natural tendency, even scientists and things, to see behavior is caused by the situation. Caused by the person, not by the situation. Right, so it's called the fundamental attribution error. So I can give you hundreds of examples of this. Let me give you one fun example of a study that demonstrates the basic phenomenon. I usually call it the trivia quiz study. And it was done based on, by a guy named Lee Ross, who actually used his own dissertation defense as sort of the inspiration for this. So for those of you who don't know, our graduate students know that you have to go, when you finish your doctoral dissertation, you have to present it in front of the faculty, and these faculty are there, and they can ask you questions about anything. They can ask you questions about your project. They can ask you questions about all of psychology. We can ask anything of those people, right? And Lee Ross went into his doctoral dissertation, really super smart guy, and these old, professors were asking him these things, and he couldn't answer. Invariably, he couldn't answer some of them, and he goes, God, I'm so stupid. Those old white guys are, they're so great, and I'm just not worthy. Until he realized, wait a minute. If you switched our roles, and I got to ask them questions about anything I knew about psychology, I could ask them things that they wouldn't know either. Right? They have the advantage. They get to ask the questions. And I have to answer them. But if I ask the questions they answer, they'd look dumb too. So I'm really not that dumb. It's the situation, it's the role that they have that gives them the advantage. And so he created a study to demonstrate that this was true. So very simple, these are Stanford University students, brought them in to participate in a trivia bowl kind of situation. And there were three different roles. There was the questioner who was told that you can come up with 10 trivia questions. They have to be general knowledge questions, like that, not what color underwear am I wearing, right? So something, about the general world, but they can be about anything you want. Anything you want. You're the questioner. The contestant has to answer those questions, and then there's an observer who just gets to watch. So they did that. Questioners invariably came up with challenging questions that the contestant couldn't answer. Right? And at the end, then everybody evaluated how smart everybody was, right? And what you get is this interesting pattern here where if you ask people, both the questioner and the contestant, or here again, the observer and the contestant's ratings of the questioner and the contestant in blue and red, right? So everybody thinks that if you ask people, how smart is the questioner compared to the contestant, everybody thinks that the questioner is smarter than the contestant. The observer sees that, the contestant walks away thinking that as well, right? Because what did you do? I just saw this questioner asked really hard questions, he acted smart. He or she acted smart. Contestant missed questions, they acted dumb. Oh, this one's smart, this one's dumb. In fact, they rate the questioner as higher than the average Stanford student in intelligence, and the contestant is lower, right? They don't recognize that the game is rigged, right? That they just see one person engaging in smart behavior and they assume that they're smart. One person engaging in dumb behavior and they assume that they're dumb. Interestingly, so that's the fundamental attribution error, that they don't acknowledge the situation in that sense. The only person that does recognize that a little bit is the questioner. Realizes that they're maybe not as smart as everybody else, because in this case, they're the average Stanford student, and they know they're not really smarter than everybody else because they know they're getting B's and C's and stuff, right? So they're the only one that somehow processes this a little bit, but other people, the contestant walks away thinking that they're dumb, and somebody who is observing the whole situation thinks the contestant is essentially dumb, right? That's the fundamental attribution error, that people should, if they were being totally rational, they would figure out that this doesn't tell them who's smart or who's dumb, but they don't. They kind of do this very quickly and assume, boy, dumb behavior means dumb person, smart behavior means smart person. Why does this occur? Right? I want to just sort of acknowledge a couple things. There's both kind of a system one error involved in here. There's the two ways this is explained, and they both carry a certain amount of weight, right? So first, there's this perceptual or cognitive error, this kind of system one idea I've been talking about, that behavior emanates out of you, right? So there's this real tendency for me, when you behave, to just sort of see you, wow, that was dumb or aggressive or smart or whatever it is, and to associate you with the behavior. The way I often describe it is that, if you saw me punch somebody in the face, right, you see that punch coming out of me. You don't see somebody's face sucking my hand toward it, right? But sometimes in the world, that's exactly what happens. The person's being such a jerk that it's like they're sucking your hand right to their face, right? The situation is doing it, but people don't see that, and that's not the way you just see that and you go, wow, what an aggressive thing, right? And then you don't adjust well. So that seems to be a universal tendency, right? So at some level, the fundamental attribution error is a universal tendency, but it's also something that's shaped by cultural differences. It's a particularly pronounced bias in Western cultures, in Western individualist cultures that tend to think about people as situations. In that Nisbet paper that you're going to read in the Norton Reader, he talks about this idea, that it's more pronounced in Western individualist cultures than in Eastern collectivist cultures. And again, it's a very subtle effect, though, and it's important, is that it happens. Everybody is prone to the fundamental attribution error. But what they find is that people in Eastern cultures who are sort of more sensitive to context are a little better able to adjust for it. Right? So if you give them you create a situation in which they can sort of, when there's a hint that it's situational, Eastern culture people collectivist people will sort of pull back from it a little bit more, and it's very hard to erase this tendency from people in Western cultures. It's that your behavior is part of you, that what you do is part and parcel of you, right? Because that's the kind of entity way that we think. So it's both a universal perceptual phenomenon that's kind of moderated by cultural influences, and that's what that Norton paper is about. So I wanted to talk about it a little bit, right? But largely, we can think about it here. Any questions about that? I know I'm going over things fast. For our standpoint, right, the best way to think about it is as this kind of system one error, right, is that we tend to respond very quickly to things, and if we see it, we tend to respond. We don't always go through all the trouble to adjust. And that's where a lot of our biases come from, right? It's this system one process, these automatic processes. And I want to talk about a few more of them now as we go through. So get out your clickers and answer this question for me. When it comes to your own driving ability, would you say you're A, a lot better than average, B, a little better than average, C, average, D, a little worse than average driver, or E, a lot worse than average? So think about your own driving behavior. Are you really a good driver, way better than average, A, a little better than average, B? Are you average, C? Are you a little worse than average driver, D, or are you a lot worse than average driver, E? So tell me how you just rate your own driving behavior. How good are you? Still got people clocking in here, okay? Okay, we're going to stop it now. Okay, so just remember this for a minute. So 35% of the people think they're just exactly average, 31 above, 11 really above, only 6% say they're the worst, and 16% say they're a little bit better. So keep that in mind for a second, and we'll come back to it. So what I want to talk about is two kinds of system 1 biases, right, that tend to affect our judgments. One are there's sort of these affective or emotional influences, that how we feel about judgments affects the judgments that we make. Right? That if they make us feel good, we're more likely to make them. We look for reasons for them. If they don't, we try to disbelieve them. So our judgments are motivated by what makes us feel good or bad. I'm going to talk about these self-enhancing biases as an example. And then we're going to talk about expectancy-based, or what are often called schema-based biases. Right? So things that are our judgments of behavior are in the present are affected by prior beliefs and attitudes, things that are already there. Both of those are system 1 kind of biases. And an example I'm going to talk about there is stereotyping and prejudice. So I'm just kind of laying out what I'm going to talk about for the next couple of minutes, right, and for the rest of the time here. So the first kind of bias we talked about is this idea of that, and there's really good evidence for this over lots of situations, that people just don't think cognitively, right? They think emotionally, that things that one of the sort of shortcuts is that things that make us feel good we want to sort of be attracted to, and things that make us feel bad we don't. And so those can affect the judgments we make. How we feel about the judgment should affect what judgment we make, right? So probably the best example of that is when we think about ourselves, and we really tend to like ourselves a lot, right? And that affects the judgments we make. So most people like themselves a lot. I know I like myself, and I know I like myself, yeah, all things considered, better than I like you, right? I do. If there's stuff, I'm not going to give all my stuff to you. I'm going to keep my stuff, and I'm going to, you know, and that's one way most people feel. Most people feel positive about themselves, and that can bias the way they process information, because I feel better about myself, more positive about myself than I feel about you. So if you do something, I might process that information differently than if I do it, right? And that people very often, when they make judgments about themselves, make them in a way that makes them look good. Because they want to look good, so they tend to embrace things that make them look good, feel good, and reject things that don't. Right? And there's lots of examples. This is this idea of self-enhancing, that many of the judgments we make enhance ourselves, make ourselves seem or feel better. You know, classic example of this is, again, in that, to use that idea of attribution, again, is what's called the self-serving attributional bias. So if you take the exam on Thursday, which I know you will, and you do really well, which I know you will, right? You're going to go, damn, I'm smart. Why did I do well on that exam? Because I'm smart. It was me. I caused it. It was my hard work, my intelligence. That's, if you want to know why I got the grade I got, it's because of me. Now I know this won't happen to you, but it's possible people won't do so well. They'll do poorly. In that situation, what do people do when they go, it's about you? Ditto. You're a terrible teacher. Your explanations make no sense. The book's impossible. Why did I get the grade I got? It's something about the situation, right? That people show this basic bias, that the self that serves themselves, that things that go well they tend to attribute to themselves, make an internal attribution, a personal causation attribution. It was caused by me. If you do poorly or reflects poorly on you, it's about somebody else, right? We make things that look like excuses. And they're not just excuses to other people, they're excuses to ourselves, right? We're saying, oh yeah, I could have done better if those questions weren't so tricky. You know, if I wasn't, if that instructor was better or whatever, right? And rationally, it shouldn't matter whether you emit the behavior or somebody else does. right? And it shouldn't matter whether you do well or do poorly. If all the other information is the same, you should make the same judgment, but people don't. They show this deviation where good things they tend to attribute to themselves, bad things they tend to attribute to other people. Lots of evidence for that, lots of evidence that it makes people feel better, and it's driven by the desire to kind of make themselves feel better. Lots of other examples of this. Another example of this basic tendency is what's called the better than average effect, right? That sometimes called the Lake Wobegon effect. Increasingly, this is becoming sort of an old generational thing. Does anybody know about Lake Wobegon or Garrison Keillor? Right, it's an old NPR show about this little town in Minnesota that he tells these folks details for, and as it goes, it's a town where the women are strong, the men are good looking, and all the children are above average, right? And so it's a funny twist because the idea is that everybody can't be above average. Somebody has to be average. But if you ask people to make judgments, they tend to make judgments so that many more people than you would imagine, a majority of people tend to hold a flattering view of themselves compared to the average person, right? So if you ask people, and we'll give our example, let's go back to our example here. So here, when you're asking your driving behavior, well, what's funny is you tend to see this kind of pattern, where if you count these up, there's only 22% of the people. Did I do that right? Yeah, 22% of the people think they're below average. Well, that's probably not true, right? Usually those things should be a little bit more even. And if you do the study in the right way, you tend to get sometimes really, really dramatic results where sometimes 90% of people perceive themselves above average. That just can't be true, right? Very unlikely to be true. You don't know who's wrong. I don't know, in this kind of paradigm, when you ask people, I don't know if you're the one that says you're good and you're not, or somebody else is, right? But you know somebody's wrong. And you find this pattern again and again and again. And it shows up if you ask people how intelligent they are, how ethical they are. There was a great, how people think they're less prejudiced than average, they think they're better drivers than average. College professors, something like 94% of college professors think they're better than average college professors. You probably know better, right? You've had some experience with them, right? And that can't be. People even think they're less biased than average, which is kind of ironic, right? They're showing the bias, and they think that they're less biased than average, right? So this is this, and there's lots of judgment like this. If you ask people about the future, they tend to be unrealistically optimistic. They tend to think that they're much less likely to have bad things happen to them in their lives than other people are. We tend to have this sort of rosy view of ourselves that, we're better than average, our futures are better than average. Oh, this just. But everyone can't be right when they say they're better than average. Another example, a quick one of this kind of phenomenon that I like. That we tend to see the world in this kind of an unthinking way as positive. Now you can get people, if you make them really think about it, they'll change these. But their first sense is that they're good, and people are attracted to things that make them feel good or that remind them of themselves. And there's this wonderful body of research that's called implicit egotism or automatic egotism, the idea that we do this really automatically. So just to read off the slide, so it says that because people have automatic positive associations with themselves, they like things and people more the more they remind them of themselves. And it produces these really weird effects that are super cool. So if you look at people have been disproportionately shown to live in states and cities that resemble their name. So what this Pelham guy does is he takes huge bodies of data, right, and he tries to control for everything, and he shows these weird associations such that people named Lewis are statistically more likely to live in St. Louis than they are in other places. People, Carolines come from Carolina more often. They move to Carolina more often. Choose careers that resemble their name. So lots of people named Dennis and Denise are Dennis, right? More than you would statistically expect. Not everybody, right? But more than you would expect. People tend to marry people whose names resemble their names. So lots of people named Jones marry people named Johnson, etc. So when they sound that people like their own birth date, they like the number that's associated with their own birth date. They'll do things, they'll show these biases. They're not aware of it, but we're attracted to things that kind of remind us of ourselves because we like ourselves, right? And you can, if you look across all this data, right, and you control for everything statistically, you can find these kind of funny effects that suggest that a lot of our behavior is driven, again, by this desire to make ourselves feel good about ourselves, that we're biased towards seeing ourselves positively. And that, we all know that there's things that we don't do well. We all know that there's things we'd rather be. I'd rather be taller and have a better head of hair and play in the NBA or play with Bruce Springsteen or something. But I don't believe any of those things because they're just not true. So people are responsive to things in the real world. We're capable of thinking things out carefully, but at an automatic level, we tend to kind of be attracted to positive things. These affective, and that's one of the sort of system one kind of effects, this kind of positive affect, and very often, a good example of that is this self-serving bias. So that's one. Any questions about that? Another clicker question. So do you think racial prejudice is a problem and is still a problem in the United States? So this is a big question that people are asked. Do you think racial prejudice is still a problem in the United States? And so your options are A, yes, I think it's a big problem. B, yeah, it's a problem, but just a little. C, it's only a problem among a small group of people. Or no, we're largely a colorblind society. Really, racial prejudice isn't a problem anymore. So just give me your impression of that. Again, A, big problem. B, little problem. C, only problem among small people. Or D, not a problem at all. Okay, let's see. So, big majority of you think, yes, it's still a big problem. Smaller set think it's still a problem, but a little bit, and almost nobody down here at the end, even among a small group of people. So you guys are seeing this as a big problem, right? Now, it's funny when you think about it, because there's ways in which the world has really changed, right, over the last 100 years. And if you look at measures of overt prejudice, right, the kind of blatant things that we used to think about, like people who hold the belief that if a black person moved into my neighborhood, I'd move, or that whites should be able to keep blacks out of their neighborhood, right? So this is just really, very, a little snippet of data, right? You can see that those sorts of overt prejudices are changing dramatically, right? They're going away. Right down to in 1994, it's actually still surprising. You still get a fair number of people on there, but again, it ends in 1994. Right, people who still believe these things. But there's this nice trend. And there you can look at all kinds of data, whether it's about blacks or Jewish people, anti-Semitism. Again, anti-gay prejudice is really a dramatic example as well, where that's one that's really changed radically over the last few years, such that the whole process is kind of tipped over. This is just data about whether you think same-sex couples should be able to get married, and it's flipped over now that more people think that they should than they shouldn't. It's gone up in every demographic, although it's still, again, sort of low in the older people. I don't necessarily need you to see these, right? We all know this, right? So there's clearly evidence that prejudice of various kinds is going down. Right? Any kind of scale you give, people will give less prejudiced responses now than they did before. We can see institutionally things are better, but we also know that there's still some things, and you guys can know this, right? There's still things that trouble us, right? Let me hit you with data first. There are hundreds of studies that demonstrate effects basically like this, that if you go out and do a simple kind of study where you take the same resume, exactly the same information, you associate with a black name or a white name with a picture of an African American or a European American, right? People will be more likely to hire the person, call them back if they're white than if they're African American. Same thing with rental, housing decisions and whether they're going to rent you an apartment. Same thing, frighteningly, with medical decisions. If you go into a doctor, they've trained patients to go in. They train an African American or a white person to go in, show exactly the same symptoms. The white person is more likely to get the invasive treatments, right? The more high-level treatments. Overwhelmingly, there's hundreds and hundreds of studies demonstrate that, again, you present people with identical information about a person, manipulate whether they're white or black, the people are less likely to hire, rent, sell, give medical treatment, treat nicely the black person than the white person. So it's still there, right? Clearly there that just because of the color of your skin, you're treated differently, right? And we know that this kind of things happens. We also know there's some sense that some of the things about President Obama just don't seem quite right? They don't seem, but there's still people who believe these things. There's still kids who are comfortable. These are actually pictures from sorority, fraternity parties. There's one where they were, playing, so you got the kid in blackface with a rope. They're kind of lynched the black kid. This is one where they're playing on the Trayvon Martin case, right? You look at these kids, they're sweet as all get out, right? Look at their faces. But they're doing these kind of horrible things, these insensitive things. We know it exists. And then finally, really, there's this thing that we were presented with. The country was, social psychology, I've been thinking about this for years, but the country was really presented with like this rash of shootings, right? The cases where an African-American young man seems to be killed by police for reasons that are very questionable, right? It happens again and again, whether it's Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Trayvon Martin, or any of the rest. The 12-year-old Tamir Rice, 12-year-old kid shot in 2 seconds. The cops get out of the car and shoot him. Right? So what's going on? Is there still a lot of prejudice? Is there not a lot of prejudice? What the heck? How do we understand this? Well, one of the things to think about is a lot of the prejudice has changed qualities over the last decades, right? Overt prejudice really is going down. It's less acceptable to say those things. People probably believe all those things much less. But there's still this remnant, there's still this association between particularly blackness and bad sorts of behavior. And it happens at this sort of automatic level. And that's what's going on. It's a more subtle kind of racism, right? Where it's not so much that people have these beliefs that are really virulently racist, right? But that they treat people differently in very subtle ways sometimes even when they're white and they're black. The exact same behavior is seen differently when it's associated with a black person and a white person, right? And that's sort of the problem. And it creates this cascade of troubles. So the best example of this is something, one of the pieces of science that generated this kind of thinking the most was the work on what's called the implicit association test. How many people have heard of the implicit association test? Anybody taken it? You can take it on the web it's called Project Implicit. Any of these things, or just type in Project Implicit if you want to take these things. And it really doesn't matter. So let me show you, before I talk more about it, let me show you a little video that captures it. It's actually from I think an NBC news show, so it takes 3 minutes or so. So watch this. This will help explain it. Make sure I got the volume up. Sorry. Where's...
Wanted anyone else to know.
I should warn you now, this isn't the same work.
These two psychologists designed the test and say that's exactly what the experiment does. And they say you'll understand exactly how once you watch it closely.
Okay, here it is.
Let's see how Rhonda fares. In the first half of the test, she's told to associate negative words and black faces with the left box, positive words and white faces with the right.
Left, right,
For instance, the word war appears. She correctly links it to the left box, which says bad and has a black face. Then there's a black face. Once again, the left box.
left, right, right, left, right.
She just as easily links the word peace to the right box, marked good with a white face.
Right.
And when a white face flashes onto the screen, Rhonda also matches that with the right box. But let's see how she does when the information is reversed, when the left box, marked bad, has a white face, and the right box, labeled good, has a black face.
Left, left.
Suddenly the test becomes much more difficult for Rhonda. About a third of the way through, she makes a mistake, linking the white face to the right box, even though that shows a black face.
I lost it.
Okay.
Has Rhonda stumbled because she unconsciously associates white with good?
What would you imagine your score might indicate?
Well, I could tell when I was taking it, I had so much of an easier time doing the white with good, much to my dismay, that I'm sure I'm showing a preference. I don't know how strong, and I'm kind of scared to find out, actually.
In fact, the test is showing a strong preference for whites.
It's upsetting, but as I said before, I'm not surprised. And I think it's because we live in an extremely racist society where messages are given to us in many different ways.
We may not be as impartial as we think we are.
Absolutely.
In fact, chances are we're not.
Chances are we're not. Something like 79 or 80% of white Americans who take the test show a preference for white over black.
Just 17% of whites show a preference for African Americans. And all of these results occurred even though we put this test to its toughest challenge, testing men and women with a dedicated commitment to racial equality. People like Jeff, who once marched with Martin Luther King Jr.
All of those things tell me who I am as a person.
And Rhonda, an attorney.
I spent the last 10 to 15 years being a civil rights lawyer and trying to do some good in the world, but that doesn't make me immune from my own internal prejudices, and I think I just need to work on that.
So, hold on for a second. Well, let me see if you still have the question when I explain it. So I just wanted, this gives you some sense of what this test is like. It's not, this isn't the way it really looks on the computer, right? But the basic idea, right, is you show people, they either have to see the same response with white and good and black is bad, or reversed around, right, where black is good and white is bad, right? And they do every combination. This is one of the things that people show. They do, some people do, white is good first. Some people do white is bad second, on the left and the right. All these things are all controlled for, counterbalanced. You don't see any of this, right? But people will show they find it much easier to associate good and white than black and bad. And what's interesting is it seems to show up on virtually everybody, right? Even people who have this kind of history of positive racial attitudes, even most African American people show the same white bias, right? So the question is, what the heck does this measure, right? What's the idea? Is this prejudice? Is this something that people should be tagged as being, oh yeah, they care, they automatically associate black and bad together, right? Does that mean they're racist, or these people don't seem like they're racist? So what do you do with that kind of thing? What was your question? Do you still have it? Counterbalancing, and yeah, so it's all it's not just the kind of practice effect. It shows up, and you can take the Project Implicit, go ahead and take, they have all sorts of them. It's about racism, about gender bias, everything, and people know it. Doesn't matter whether you know about it, because the whole idea is you can't control it, right? The reason they do it this way, right, is it's something you can't control. You can't just make yourself look good, right? You just have to respond really quickly to this, and it has these effects, right? So what does this do, right? People don't think it's really prejudice, but it changes what it is, that there's these associations that are out there in the world that almost everybody has. So what can they do? Well, the idea is that in this kind of unthinking way, they can show this kind of cascade effect where they very often will lead to very bad kinds of behaviors, right? Just because of these kind of automatic associations are there. The way they're often referred to, another term that I used, that lots of people use to talk about it, is expectancy confirmation biases. Right? That if the idea of, you have an expectancy, you have this sort of belief that blacks are bad, and that changes the way you process information. The people organize information in the world, again, into these kind of bundles. It's a term that's, I think, that's called schema. I think that's in your text somewhere, so I wanted to sort of tag it for you. Right? These schemata, which is plural for schema, then guide subsequent behavior. Again, it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. First of all, it's perfectly reasonable for you to use what you know or what you expect to happen to determine your behavior. If you didn't do that, you would be silly, right? If you walked into your apartment every day and there was the lights were off and you saw that dark thing in the corner that was laying there and you said, oh my God, maybe it's a bear, right? And every day you did that even though it's your couch. And you knew it was your couch, and even though you couldn't see it that well, you figured out it was your couch. Right? If you didn't learn and figure out that was your couch, you'd be stupid, right? You can't. You can't approach every situation anew, right? But that same process that's so functional, right, can also tend to bias how you perceive situations, how you act in situations in ways that tend to make your stereotypes come true in various ways. So and there's kind of two, there's a perceptual confirmation and behavioral confirmation. Let me see if I can kind of whip through those in 8 minutes here that I've got. So here's what do you see? Say it out loud. Right, now what do you see? Right? Have anybody seen this on the internet? Now the internet ruins everything, so, right? Well, that thing in the middle that you saw as a B in the top row, you saw as a 13 in the bottom row. They're exactly the same stimulus. They're the same thing. So why did you see them as a B at the top and a 13 at the bottom? Because of the context, of the situation, the expectancy. You saw A, you assume it's B, so you clarify it perfectly. If you didn't do that, right, it would be silly. They tell you got to use the context to figure things out, but at the same time it produces this weird effect so that exactly the same thing is perceived differently depending on what's the situation that you're in that case, right? Well, the same thing happens in racial situations. Exactly the same behavior, that's the phenomenon, right? The same behavior is perceived differently if it's done by a black person, done by a white person, right? Lots of experimental examples of that I'm not going to go through here, but let me give you one nice example. This is after Hurricane Katrina. This is cut off the internet. So the first thing up here is a young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store in New Orleans, right? So he's looting, you go down here, this nice white couple down here. 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. They just found it there. It wasn't looting or anything. It was on the shelves and they took it and ran out the door. They found it, right? Black people loot things, exactly the same behavior. White people find things, right? That's the thing. It's exactly the same behavior, but it has this negative, right? It takes on this negative quality when it becomes associated with African American people. There's lots of good experimental examples. I'm not going to talk about that. Let me talk about a slightly more subtle example of the same thing. So here's a study where they actually simply flashed a black face or a white face very, very quickly before they asked people to make a basic discrimination. Then they showed them a picture of either a tool or a gun afterwards, right? So you had to decide, is that a tool or is that a gun? Right? And after you've just seen a black face or just seen a white face. And you can look at how often they make misperception errors. So when it's a gun, interestingly, there's really not much of a difference. There's a slight tendency for people to make slightly more mistakes when they say a white face to say a tool is really a gun. Or a gun is really a tool, excuse me. But what the interesting effect is over here, right? If you've just seen a black face flashed underneath, very quickly, right before you have to make this discrimination, people, when they see the black face, they have a much higher probability of saying, oh, that's a gun. Misperceiving a tool, like a wrench, as a gun. They see the black gun, they see it, right, and just like that, they perceive it that way. So why do these shootings happen? What's going on here, right? Well, some of it is the person does the same, a black person, a white person does the same thing. It's perceived differently, right? When a black kid does something slightly provocative, it might be seen as provocative. A white kid does it, it doesn't, right? And the cops are more likely to do what the behavior requires. Oh, they think that they need to shoot. Lots of studies just like this have been done with police simulations, right? It's called shooter bias. So you do a simulation, a video simulation, people running around, you have to decide really quickly, is that a bad guy or a good guy? Is he armed or not? You got to shoot him if he's armed, you don't shoot him if he's not, right? They manipulate so that it's a white stimulus person or an African American stimulus person, and you see the same effect, right? It's just the number of errors, right? So when it's a black person, they're much more likely to decide to shoot them even when they're unarmed, right? Is it because these people are prejudiced? Well, it's hard to know. African American cops do the same thing. Latino cops do the same thing. They show the same bias, right? But look how it disproportionately affects people, right? So just because guys, we've got 4 more minutes. So you can hang with me. I got a clock right there. 4 more minutes. Finish the story, right? So this is exactly the kind of problems that happen, right? Is that just because through these automatic tendencies, right, people perceive things differently. But they also, it changes the way you change, that you talk about behavior. I'm not going to talk too much about this. I'll leave the slide up there. But the basic idea is you can take this completely out of, there's another process just besides perception. It also changes the way you act. So this is this wonderful study that was done years ago where they took a group of elementary school kids. They told the teacher some of them were really smart and they were going to get smart over the course of the quarter, the semester, and then some of the kids were just left alone, right? And what happens is the kids that the teacher thought were going to get smarter actually got smarter. When you tested them at the end, they were better. Because the teacher treated them different. When the teacher thinks you're smart, the teacher gives you more attention, treats you differently, acts on that expectancy, and it actually sometimes produces the effect. I mean, these kids weren't just perceived to be smarter, they actually became smarter on tests because they were labeled that way. So you can imagine, you could do it on the positive side, you get labeled as positive, people act towards you positively. You get labeled in a negative way, right? It has this negative cascading effect that people assume that bad things are going to happen. So here's another older example that I want to talk about. A very famous case of Amadou Diallo, right? A West African kid sitting in New York City on his stoop. There's 4 cops, plainclothes policemen, who were looking for a rapist, I think, is what it was, who vaguely fit his description. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. They pull up, they see Amadou Diallo sitting on his stoop of his house. They pull up, they get out, they start going toward him, right? He gets a little nervous. He doesn't know why these 4 white guys, not maybe cops, maybe I don't know what's going on. He reaches back to do something. One of the cops starts to go up the stairs. He actually trips and falls back down as Amadou's kind of pulling out this thing, and then he gets shot 41 times and killed right there. Right? And what it turns out he was doing was he was pulling out his wallet to show them his ID. Right? But in the hands of a black man, a wallet can be easily mistaken for a gun. And that's exactly what happened. They saw something very quickly. The person fell down. They thought something had been shot. They see something, him reaching for something. Boom, 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 he's dead. Right? The question is, would he have been dead if he was white? Right? And how is it that, again, his behavior, he was nervous, he did something, they did things, the whole thing cascaded out of control very quickly because of these basic expectancies, because people are reacting very quickly. They're afraid, there's threat, right? And it all comes down to, there's not really as much intention as you would think, right? It's not the kind of prejudice, it's not your grandparents' kind of prejudice, right? It's this other kind of prejudice where it's just that the same person gets treated differently. This is, the whole idea is that if somebody was a different color, would they be treated differently? And how often does that disadvantage certain people? Again, it's a classic kind of system 1 effect, good example of the sort of things social psychologists love to study. How it is that your perceptions affect your behavior and contribute to these social problems. Think about that. Study hard. Go to your discussion sections. And we'll see you on Thursday. Get here early. Get set up. We'll do the exam. Good luck.